The late summer of 2025 brought a sudden surge of tension to the warm waters of the Caribbean. For years, the region had been a stage of narcotics trafficking routes and political maneuvering, but few expected it to become the center of a naval standoff involving some of the most advanced warships in the world. When Washington announced the deployment of a full task force, including the guided missile cruiser USS Lake Erie, several Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, an amphibious assault ship, and the nuclear-powered submarine USS Newport News, the move signaled more than routine patrols. It was a show of power that echoed across the hemisphere and sent a clear warning to Caracas. Official statements framed the operation as a strike against organized crime, yet analysts quickly noted that the scale and composition of the force carried implications that reached far beyond counter-narcotics missions. On the decks of the American warships, sailors felt the weight of this reality. The Caribbean was not a distant sea, but a contested neighborhood where every maneuver was visible to regional powers and every radar sweep risked misinterpretation. Venezuelan leaders condemned the deployment as a violation of sovereignty and vowed to resist what they described as intimidation. Russian and Chinese observers monitored the unfolding situation with interest, recognizing that the Caribbean had become a microcosm of global rivalry. Each vessel carried not only missiles and sensors, but also the burden of signaling intent in an environment where ambiguity could ignite conflict. The proximity of coastal batteries, patrol aircraft, and naval bases meant that the Americans operated under constant exposure. Tension was not abstract. It was felt in the rhythm of alarms, the steady hum of engines, and the quiet readiness of crews trained to react in seconds. The stage was set for confrontation. With more than 4,000 American personnel deployed and Venezuelan forces mobilized along their coastline, the possibility of escalation hung over every hour of operations. The balance of power rested on technology, discipline, and the ability to make decisions without hesitation. As the task force cut through the Caribbean night, the sense of inevitability grew. It was no longer a question of whether a test would come, but only when. And when the first radar contact flickered onto the screens of the USS Lake Erie, the crews understood that the moment had arrived. This is the true story of what happened next. The first signs of the operation emerged in late August 2025 as the U.S. Navy cruiser USS Lake Erie and its escorts cut through the Caribbean waters under a sky that was both oppressive and tense. The immediate mission was surveillance in presence, holding position near international waters close to Venezuelan territory. The sea state was moderate with heavy humidity that distorted the horizon and made radar returns slightly more difficult to filter. The command crew knew that the strategic objective was not simply to patrol, but to establish dominance in a corridor that had become contested by criminal networks and political actors alike. Every radar sweep carried weight since the proximity to Venezuelan air and naval forces meant that any sudden contact could escalate into a confrontation that neither side openly declared, yet both prepared for. Within the operations center, the air was heavy with restrained anticipation as operators leaned over consoles where faint traces of electronic noise hinted at surveillance assets probing the fleet's position. No shot had been fired, but the battle had already begun in the invisible spectrum of detection and counter-detection. The USS Lake Erie operated with its Aegis combat system in full watch status, and its phased array radar constantly tracked surface and air contacts across hundreds of miles. The cruiser was joined by the guided missile destroyers USS Gravely and USS Jason Dunham, which provided overlapping coverage of the approaches from the south and east. Together, they formed a shield that was less visible to the naked eye than to the electronic picture forming on their displays. At intervals, the submarine USS Newport News reported its submerged patrol pattern through encrypted bursts that relayed sonar contacts and environmental readings. Each update gave the surface ships a clearer picture of what moved beneath them. Overhead, Maritime Patrol Aircraft P-8 Poseidon orbited on long legs of surveillance, feeding data into the network and expanding the awareness bubble. The systems meshed into a digital net that sought to expose the first sign of hostile intent, whether from an unidentified aircraft closing too quickly or a fast boat attempting to shadow the formation. The tactical decision at this point was restraint balanced with readiness, and commanders emphasized rules of engagement that demanded certainty before escalation. Still, the layered array of sensors and weapons was primed, with the close-in weapon systems tracking sectors and the standard missiles held on alert for immediate firing sequences. The outcome of these opening hours was not measured in explosions, but in the certainty that a threshold had been crossed. The presence of so many U.S. naval assets within striking range of Venezuelan shores was itself an action that demanded response. Inside the Venezuelan command center's radar operators also watched the same skies and seas, aware that their every move was mirrored on American screens. The balance was delicate, and even a single misinterpreted contact could trigger orders that would alter the course of the operation. As the fleet held its position, a new electronic signature flickered on the Aegis display, one that was stronger and closer than the faint background clutter of before. The operators exchanged glances because the clarity of the trace suggested more than routine traffic. The tension rose in silence as officers leaned forward, realizing that the first real test of the deployment was about to unfold, and that the shadow of confrontation was moving from speculation into reality. The calm surface of the Caribbean concealed a storm of intentions as Venezuelan coastal radar stations picked up the silhouettes of the U.S. Navy task force holding steady in international waters. Within Caracas, the government framed the deployment as an overt act of intimidation, and local commanders were tasked with making the American presence as uncomfortable as possible without triggering an all-out war. Patrol aircraft were launched from bases near Puerto Cabello and began flying patterns that pushed toward the limits of international airspace. On the American screens inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Lake Erie, these aircraft appeared as amber symbols that required constant watch. The tension increased with every minute the contacts remained aloft because the probability of deliberate probing or sudden aggression was rising. The tactical objective for the Venezuelans was simple yet dangerous: demonstrate defiance through close maneuvers, harassing overflights, and aggressive signaling that could wear down discipline and increase the risk of miscalculation by the Americans. The first real move came when a pair of Sukhoi Su-30 fighters closed distance on the formation at a speed and altitude that indicated more than mere training. Their radar emissions lit up across the Aegis system, allowing the USS Lake Erie and its escorts to lock tracks and analyze threat profiles in real time. Electronic warfare officers noted shifts in the frequencies used by the approaching jets, suggesting that jamming pods had been activated. In response, the American formation elevated its posture without firing. Standard missile launchers were made ready. The close-in weapon systems rotated into optimal arcs, and the P-8 Poseidon orbiting overhead shifted course to extend radar coverage. The submarine USS Newport News adjusted depth and bearing to monitor the undersea environment for any Venezuelan submarine activity that might accompany the air harassment. Each system activated in sequence represented a measured step in escalation control, ensuring that the Americans retained tactical superiority without crossing into open combat. On the bridge, the commanding officer issued calm but precise orders, reminding the crew that restraint was as much a weapon as firepower at this stage. The outcome of this opening move was a prolonged standoff. The Venezuelan fighters executed aggressive passes, at times descending low enough for visual identification before banking away sharply. Their intent was unmistakable: to force the U.S. Navy into revealing defensive patterns, to measure response times, and to test the will of the American crews under stress. For hours, the air above the task force vibrated with the roar of afterburners and the electronic hiss of radar sweeps colliding in the spectrum. Yet beneath the surface of managed calm lay the awareness that this was only the opening act. The Americans had successfully held formation, denying their opponents any exploitable weakness. But the sense on every deck was that something larger was building beyond the horizon. As night approached, radar operators detected faint emissions inconsistent with Venezuelan fighters, signatures that hinted at additional players entering the theater. The crew realized the adversary's opening gambit was not the final word, but merely the first turn in a dangerous game that was about to escalate. The Venezuelan probes had made their presence felt, but the U.S. Navy task force was not positioned to absorb pressure without response. As the Su-30 fighters faded into the distance and unidentified radar traces hinted at new entrants into the battle space. The American commanders decided that the time had come to reinforce their defenses and demonstrate the depth of their layered capabilities. The mission objective in this phase was to deter escalation by establishing a shield that was both visible and invisible, blending electronic warfare with traditional missile coverage. Sea conditions remained steady, though the onset of evening reduced visibility and forced greater reliance on sensors. The tension aboard the USS Lake Erie was palpable as operators coordinated with their counterparts on the USS Gravely and USS Jason Dunham to initiate countermeasure protocols. For the sailors manning the consoles, this was the moment where preparation met reality, and every keystroke translated into actions that could determine survival if the situation tipped toward open conflict. The countermeasure deployment began with the electronic warfare suites powering into active defense mode. Specialized antennas broadcast jamming signals that masked the fleet's exact position and interfered with potential targeting radars. The cruiser's SPY-1 radar, heart of the Aegis system, simultaneously maintained precision tracks on every contact, ensuring that protective fire could be ordered in seconds. Above the formation, a P-8 Poseidon released a series of sonobuoys that spread across the waters, creating an underwater net of acoustic sensors designed to expose any hostile submarine. This network linked back to the USS Newport News, which silently adjusted its patrol track to hunt for intruders. On the surface, the destroyers activated their vertical launch systems, uploading engagement sequences for standard missiles capable of intercepting aircraft or cruise missiles long before they could close the distance. Drones were also brought into play, launched from the decks of the amphibious support ships to extend surveillance and provide a rapid relay of video feeds over contested sectors. Each system added another layer to a defense in depth that was meant to convince any adversary that a strike would be futile. The effect of this deployment was immediate and visible on the tactical screens. The unidentified radar traces that had been edging closer began to retreat once jamming disrupted their ability to achieve stable locks. Venezuelan aircraft reduced the frequency of their aggressive passes as American destroyers illuminated the skies with radar that left no doubt about their readiness to fire. The sea was alive with signals, both real and deceptive, as countermeasures created a fog designed to confuse any hostile targeting. For the crews, it was a demonstration that the balance of initiative had shifted back into American hands. Yet the reprieve carried its own warning, because even as the task force layered its shields, a new alert appeared on the network. This time, it was not a fighter or a radar ping, but a heat plume rising fast from coastal territory. Consistent with the launch of a shore-based missile system, the operators froze for a fraction of a second as confirmation cascaded through the channels. The countermeasures had held the line against probing aircraft, but now a different and more lethal challenge was racing across the sky, and seconds would decide whether the shield was strong enough. The sudden launch signature detected by the Aegis system marked a turning point in the confrontation. What had begun as a battle of sensors and probing aircraft now shifted into the deadly realm of live missile fire. The plume rising from Venezuelan coastal territory carried with it uncertainty, because operators had to determine within seconds whether the weapon was a surface-to-surface missile targeting the fleet or a training launch intended as a signal. The environment compounded the danger as night settled fully over the Caribbean, leaving the fleet reliant entirely on radar screens and electronic warning receivers. The immediate operational objective became clear and absolute: intercept the inbound threat before it could reach the defensive perimeter. Every crew member understood that the difference between a successful intercept and a failed reaction could mean the loss of a ship and the ignition of open conflict across the region. The USS Lake Erie executed its training with precision as the Aegis system processed the trajectory of the incoming weapon. Within moments, the system classified the missile as a potential anti-ship strike and recommended engagement. The commanding officer gave the order, and a standard missile erupted from the vertical launch system, streaking into the sky in a plume of fire. The destroyers USS Gravely and USS Jason Dunham added their own interceptors, creating a layered defense designed to increase the probability of a kill. High above, the P-8 Poseidon relayed targeting data to refine the intercept path, while electronic warfare operators flooded the airwaves with jamming meant to confuse the missile's guidance. Meanwhile, the submarine USS Newport News reported no underwater threats, confirming that this attack was isolated to shore-based batteries. The tension on the command deck was electric as sailors tracked the glowing arc of their defensive missiles climbing to meet the incoming weapon. The impact on the tactical display was almost instantaneous. The hostile track suddenly fragmented as the intercept connected and radar returns showed debris tumbling into the sea. Relief swept through the crew, but it was tempered by the realization that the engagement might not be over. The interception demonstrated the strength of the layered shield, but it also triggered a new phase of escalation. Within minutes, additional launch signatures appeared along the coastline, indicating that Venezuelan batteries were preparing or had already fired more missiles. The enemy had shifted tactics from harassment to outright engagement, and the fleet was now within an active threat envelope. For the American commanders, the challenge multiplied because intercepting a single missile was expected, but facing a salvo required coordination and endurance. The crew of the USS Lake Erie recalibrated firing solutions while destroyers prepared to launch further salvos of interceptors. Overhead, drones streamed real-time video of launch sites glowing against the night. Every operator knew that the defensive battle was entering a phase where volume could overwhelm even the most advanced system. The successful intercept had bought seconds, not safety, and as the alarms echoed across the compartments, sailors braced for the next wave that was already rising from the Venezuelan coast. The task force had endured the pressure of multiple launches and repeated probes. The defensive net had proven strong, intercepting missiles and confusing hostile sensors, but endurance alone could not secure the mission. Commanders understood that a prolonged defensive posture invited exhaustion and risked the chance of saturation by successive salvos. The decision was taken to shift from absorbing pressure to seizing the initiative. The operational objective became suppression of enemy launch capacity, targeting the very coastal batteries that had attempted to overwhelm the fleet. The night sky over the Caribbean concealed the approach of American strike assets, and the sea itself became the platform for a decisive turn. The USS Lake Erie, USS Gravely, and USS Jason Dunham recalculated firing solutions, aligning their vertical launch systems not only for intercept but also for long-range strike missions. This phase was no longer about simply surviving. It was about ensuring the adversary could not continue to threaten the fleet. The counterattack began with the unmistakable roar of Tomahawk cruise missiles leaving their cells in succession. Each missile carried precision targeting data compiled by drones, maritime patrol aircraft, and the Aegis network. Flying low and fast, the weapons skimmed over the water before bending inland toward identified launch sites. At the same time, the submarine USS Newport News contributed its own salvo from a submerged position, launching missiles from beneath the waves to converge on the same coordinates. Overhead, the P-8 Poseidon maintained constant surveillance, feeding updates into the command system to refine trajectories in flight. The American destroyers formed a protective shell around the cruiser as the strike unfolded, prepared to repel any retaliatory attempt from the air or sea. The fleet's electronic warfare suites blanketed the spectrum with jamming intended to blind hostile radars and complicate Venezuelan command and control. This combined arms approach represented a textbook application of layered offense and defense, where naval power was projected ashore with precision and timing. The impact of the strike was both physical and psychological. Explosions lit the coastline as Tomahawks reached their programmed targets, silencing radar emitters and missile batteries that had fired earlier in the night. Secondary detonations indicated that ammunition stores had been struck, further degrading the adversary's ability to launch again. On the tactical display, the number of active threats diminished rapidly, replaced by empty sectors where once hostile tracks had clustered. For the crews aboard the American ships, the sight of their systems executing as designed restored confidence and shifted the emotional balance from tension to controlled determination. Yet even in victory, the atmosphere carried no complacency. Intelligence feeds suggested that not all batteries had been destroyed, and new emissions hinted that additional assets might be repositioning inland. The counterattack had broken the immediate wave of hostility and seized the initiative, but officers understood that escalation was not finished. The fleet had struck hard, but the question now was whether adversaries would concede the blow or answer with another unpredictable move. The Caribbean night remained alive with uncertainty, and the next phase promised to test the limits once again. The counterstrike had silenced several hostile batteries, but the mission was not complete. Commanders understood that the danger did not end with destroyed launchers. Secondary threats often emerged when an adversary attempted to recover from a major strike. Intelligence reports indicated unusual activity at a Venezuelan port facility where fast attack craft had been observed preparing for sortie. The operational objective shifted from pure defense and suppression to ensuring freedom of navigation for the task force by eliminating these residual risks. The Caribbean night remained tense, illuminated only by scattered fires along the coast and the steady glow of naval instrumentation. Every sailor knew that complacency could turn victory into vulnerability. The fleet prepared for a final sweep to secure the maritime approaches and neutralize any platform that could still challenge American control of the battle space. The sweep unfolded as multiple layers of surveillance converged on the port area. Drones streamed live imagery that confirmed small craft moving at high speed from sheltered docks. Maritime patrol aircraft expanded radar coverage and identified the boats as fast missile craft, each capable of launching weapons that could threaten destroyers if allowed to close distance. The decision was immediate. The USS Gravely and USS Jason Dunham maneuvered into intercept positions, while the USS Lake Erie coordinated targeting data through the Aegis network. Surface-to-surface missiles were prepared, and naval gunners stood ready to employ rapid-fire systems against any vessel that broke through. The submarine USS Newport News advanced silently, positioning itself to cut off potential escape routes beneath the surface. Electronic warfare suites created false signals across the spectrum, masking the exact positions of the task force while amplifying the picture of incoming boats for precise engagement. Within minutes, the first salvos were fired, precision-guided weapons streaking across the sea to strike the fast craft before they could form an attack run. The drones captured the detonations in real time, confirming the destruction of the leading wave. The outcome of the sweep was decisive but carried a sobering reminder. The missile boats were destroyed, and the port facility itself showed signs of secondary explosions, eliminating the immediate capacity for further harassment. The fleet had demonstrated not only the ability to defend, but also to project control over contested waters. Yet, as the tactical displays cleared, signals analysts reported intermittent emissions from deeper inland, suggesting that other systems had gone dark and might re-emerge at a time of choosing. The lesson was that modern conflict rarely ended with a single exchange. Even as the U.S. Navy secured the sea lanes for the moment, the adversary retained the ability to regenerate threats from hidden positions. For the crews, the sweep provided a sense of closure to the night's battle, but it also underscored the reality that vigilance could not falter. The Caribbean remained a chessboard alive with pieces still in play, and what had been contained for one night could ignite again with little warning. The battle that played out across the waters of the Caribbean revealed the thin line that separates deterrence from open war. The United States Navy entered the theater under the official mandate of countering narcotics networks, yet the reality of the deployment was one of strategic pressure and contested presence. Each engagement showed how modern naval forces operate under constant tension between restraint and overwhelming power. Defensive systems intercepted missiles in flight, and layered countermeasures confused hostile radars, while precision strikes demonstrated that to suppress threats ashore. What emerged was a portrait of naval warfare in the 21st century, where information dominance, rapid decision cycles, and the integration of air, sea, and subsurface assets define survival. For the crews who executed these actions, the experience was not abstract but lived second by second under the weight of responsibility. The aftermath left both clarity and uncertainty. On one hand, the fleet succeeded in holding the line, eliminating hostile batteries and neutralizing fast missile craft that could have endangered freedom of navigation. The tactical objectives were achieved without the loss of a single ship. On the other hand, the signals of surviving systems inland and the political reactions from Caracas underscored that the confrontation was not concluded in any lasting sense. The adversary had absorbed damage yet retained the ability to regenerate capability. The message for strategists was unmistakable. A single deployment can shape the balance of power, but it cannot resolve the underlying contest of will and legitimacy. For Washington, the operation sent a signal of resolve. For Venezuela, it confirmed that resistance would draw overwhelming attention and force. For the sailors involved, it carved memories of tension and relief that would remain long after the ships returned to port. The larger implication is that the Caribbean has once again become a proving ground for maritime power. Future conflicts will not unfold in distant oceans alone, but also in the contested waters of the Western Hemisphere. The integration of drones, precision strike, and electronic warfare displayed in this operation provides a glimpse of what future naval battles will demand. The margin for error is narrow and the cost of miscalculation immense. If you believe stories like this matter and that we must understand modern war before it happens again, subscribe, like, and comment to support the channel.